Do you need something that requires someone else to have a change of heart? Maybe it's your boss, maybe it's your spouse, maybe it has to do with your pastor or some committee or some board or some government official. But you need somebody else to have a change of heart so that you can get what you need to serve God and to do life effectively. Well, in the book of Nehemiah, that is the case. Nehemiah has been taken captive, and now he's working for the pagan king as his cupbearer. But he gets news that the walls of Jerusalem have been knocked down, and so he has a burden to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the walls, because you can't rebuild the city in that day until you rebuild the walls. But there's a problem. He's got to ask the king for permission. He's got to get permission to return to Jerusalem, permission to rebuild the walls. He's got to get permission to be gone for 3 years. That's a big thing to ask. He's got to also, he wants to ask the king to give him the supplies he needs to rebuild the walls, and on top of that, a military escort to give him safe passage so he can travel back from Babylon all the way to Jerusalem. This is a big ask. And you got to realize, king in that day, if the cupbearer came into his presence unhappy, he could have the man killed immediately. Well, Nehemiah does what Nehemiah did all through the book of Nehemiah. He turned his problem into prayer. And his prayers had several components. First of all, he had fasting. He didn't eat. You know, when you want something bad enough that you want it more than food, that gets God's attention. Besides that, he came with praise. He praised the God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant, who keeps his promises. He says, God, I praise you because you are the promise-keeping God. He prayed persistently. He kept praying. He said, I've been asking you about this day and night, day and night. And then he confessed the sins, not only of himself, but those of his people. He made sure everything was right with God. Then he reminded God of God's promises. He quoted the Bible. He prayed Scripture, Deuteronomy chapter 4, Deuteronomy chapter 30. He quoted that back to God. And the last thing is he asked God to give him favor when he spoke with the king. That prayer is found in verse 11. He says, Please, Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant who delight to revere your name. Give your servant success today and grant him favor, compassion in the presence of this man, the king. He said, For I am the king's cupbearer. Well, the next day comes, and later on that day it comes where he's in the presence of the king, and it's interesting what he does. He says, So I prayed to the God of heaven. I prayed to the God of heaven, and the king said, What's wrong? And then I answered the king. He talked to God first, and then he talked to the king. And he says, If it pleases the king, if your servant has been found favor with you, send me to Judah. And he tells, I want to go back and rebuild the city. I want to rebuild the walls. And he gives all his requests, and it says at the end of verse 8, the king granted my request, for I was graciously strengthened by my God. God's gracious hand, God's good hand was upon me. The king granted my request. Is there something you need to happen, but somebody else has to have a change of heart before it can happen? Ask God for favor. Pray with fasting. Pray with praise. Confess sin and get everything right with God. Pray the Scripture back to God. Keep asking. Be persistent. And ask God for favor. That is a prayer God likes to answer.